The emergency room at St. Bridget's Medical Centre was a place where the air always smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and it was here that a woman named Elena Castillo spent her nights folding sheets and pretending she didn't exist. She moved slowly, her left leg dragging just enough to make her co-workers sigh in impatience, her hands wrapped around a mop handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Elena was 42 years old, but the lines around her eyes made her look older, and the grey streak in her dark hair that she never bothered to dye out told the world she had stopped caring about what anyone thought of her a long time ago. The other nurses called her the ghost. The doctors didn't call her anything at all, because to them she was furniture, a piece of the hospital that hummed in the background and moved chairs from one room to the next without complaint. She cleaned up blood. She wiped away tears. She emptied bedpans for patients who looked through her like she was glass, and she never once asked for a thank you, because Elena had learned a long time ago that the world did not give medals to people who served in silence. There was a small scar that ran along her right temple, a thin white line that disappeared into her hairline, and if anyone had bothered to ask about it, she would have told them it was from a fall down the stairs. But that was a lie she told so many times that the truth had become something she carried in her chest like a stone, a memory that smelled like gunpowder and burnt sand, and the sound of a helicopter blades cutting through the desert air. 11 years ago, Elena had not been a nurse at all. Elena had been a soldier. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed softly as she pushed her cart down the hallway, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, and somewhere in the distance a phone rang and was never answered. The waiting room was nearly empty tonight, just a few coughing patients and a tired mother holding a sleeping child, and Elena liked it that way. The quiet was the only thing that made her feel safe, the only thing that kept her from waking up at 3 in the morning, with her hand reaching for a weapon that no longer hung from her hip. If you believe that some heroes wear uniforms we never see, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to join our family of hidden lifelines. Your support helps us tell the stories of those who sacrificed everything in silence. She paused by the window at the end of the corridor, the city lights twinkling far below like a constellation that had fallen from the sky and scattered across the pavement, and she thought about a boy she had once loved who was buried in a cemetery in Arlington. His name was Thomas. He had been 23 years old. He had called her ma'am even though they were the same age, and he had laughed at her terrible jokes, and he had died in her arms in a country she still could not pronounce correctly, bleeding out behind a broken wall while a helicopter circled overhead and could not land because a sandstorm had turned the sky into a wall of brown. Elena blinked hard, pushing the memory down into the place where she kept all her ghosts, and she turned away from the window and went back to her cart. She had work to do. The world did not stop for broken hearts. It was just past 2 in the morning when the world outside St. Bridget's exploded with the sound of sirens that were not the kind of sirens Elena was used to hearing. These sirens were deeper, sharper, the kind that belonged to armored vehicles, and as Elena stepped into the hallway, she saw heads turning and patients sitting up in their beds with wide eyes. The nurse's station was suddenly alive with chatter, the receptionist staring at her computer screen as if she had seen a ghost, and the head doctor, Dr. Marcus, was already pulling on his white coat, his face the color of old paper. Something was happening, something big. Elena felt a small tremor start somewhere deep in her chest, a familiar vibration that she had not felt in over a decade, and she told herself to ignore it, to keep her head down, to keep being the ghost. Nobody needed the ghost to be anything else. But then the doors burst open, and the night changed forever. 4 men stormed into the lobby, their boots hitting the tile in a rhythm that Elena's body recognized before her mind could catch up, and they were not regular soldiers. They were not the clean-cut recruits she saw on television. They were operators, hard-faced men with eyes that had seen the inside of countries that no longer existed, and they wore tactical gear that looked like it had been dragged through mud and fire. They carried a stretcher between them, and on that stretcher was a man whose face was pale as candle wax, his chest rising and falling in shallow little breaths that looked like they might stop at any second. Elena's blood ran cold because she knew this man. She had read about him in the newspapers once, years ago, when he had been awarded a medal she could not remember the name of. He was a Navy SEAL commander, one of the highest-ranking special operations officers in the entire country, and right now, he was dying in the doorway of her hospital. Behind the stretcher walked another man, larger than the rest, his uniform soaked through with rain, and beside him was a dog. A massive Belgian Malinois, his ears sharp and his eyes the color of amber, his hackles raised high along his back like a wave frozen in place. The dog was not on a leash. The dog was not behaving like any dog Elena had ever seen in a hospital before. The dog was pacing beside his handler with a low, guttural growl building in his throat, and when Dr. Marcus stepped forward with his hands raised, the dog snapped his teeth so close to the doctor's wrist that the entire lobby flinched backward. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The dog had taken up a position between his fallen commander and the entire medical staff, and he was daring any of them to come closer. If you think this dog's behavior is about to change everything, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion of this incredible journey. We upload stories of courage every single day just for you. The commander's handler, the man holding the leash, shouted that the commander had collapsed during a classified operation, that his heart had stopped twice in the vehicle, that every second mattered. Dr. Marcus tried to speak, his voice shaking like a leaf, telling the operators that they needed to bring their patient into trauma room 1, that they needed the dog to be locked up somewhere, that the animal was a liability. But the handler shook his head, his eyes wild with panic, and told them that the dog would not let anyone near him, that the dog had been trained to kill anyone who threatened his commander, that the last handler who had tried to approach the commander during a medical emergency had been bitten through his tactical glove. The dog, whose name was apparently Hades, stood in the middle of the lobby like a four-legged sniper, his body coiled and ready, his eyes scanning every face in the room with the focus of a weapon. The nurses backed away. The doctors backed away. The operators formed a tense half-circle around the stretcher, their hands on their holsters, unsure whether they were trying to protect the commander from the doctors or from his own dog. Elena watched all of this from the corner of the lobby, her mop still in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs, and something inside her chest was waking up that she had spent 11 years trying to bury. She had trained dogs like Hades. She had been one of the first female military working dog handlers to ever deploy with the Special Operations community, and she had spent 6 years of her life learning how to read the body language of animals that were taught to bite first and never look back. She knew the subtle twitch of an ear that meant a dog was about to redirect. She knew the slow, controlled breathing that meant a dog was on the edge of a command threshold. She knew that Hades was not being aggressive because he was angry. Hades was being aggressive because he was terrified. His commander was dying, and the entire world smelled like fear and antiseptic, and the loyal animal did not know who to trust with the only person he had ever loved. Elena set down her mop. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. She did not ask for permission. She simply stepped forward, her limp dragging slightly behind her, and she began to walk across the lobby floor toward the snarling beast with the same quiet calm she used to use when she crossed minefields in Kandahar. The nurses at the station whispered urgently to one another, telling each other that the janitor had lost her mind, that the dog was going to rip her apart, that they should call security. Dr. Marcus shouted at her to stop, told her that she had no medical training, told her to get back to her duties or she would be fired on the spot. Elena did not stop. She kept walking, her eyes locked on Hades, her hands open at her sides, her breathing slow and deliberate the way her instructor had taught her so many years ago in a dusty training yard in Texas. If you believe that courage comes in many shapes, please subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Every share helps us find the next hidden hero. When she was 10 feet away from Hades, she stopped. She did not kneel down. She did not reach out her hand. Instead, she did something that made every single person in the lobby gasp at the same time. She began to whistle. Not a high-pitched, cheerful whistle, but a low, tooted melody, the kind of sound that belonged to a training field at 3 in the morning when the world was empty, and the handlers ran their dogs through the most dangerous LS of their lives. It was a melody that no civilian would ever know. It was a melody that belonged only to the small, secret world of operators who had spent years forging bonds with animals that were taught to fight like soldiers. Hades' ears rotated like little satellite dishes toward the sound, his snarl faltering for just a fraction of a second, and Elena spoke. She spoke one word in a language that was a mixture of Dutch and army slang, a command that she had not used in over a decade but that came flowing out of her mouth as naturally as breathing. The word meant stand down. It meant I am your handler now. It meant trust me. Hades looked at her. The dog looked at this woman with the grey streak in her hair and the limp in her leg and the faded hospital uniform, and something old and buried deep inside him recognized what his eyes were seeing. The dog let out a single, low whine, long and mournful, the sound of a soldier surrendering to a memory, and he sat down. He did not roll over. He did not beg. He simply lowered his huge head and sat firmly on the tile floor, his eyes never leaving Alina's face, his breathing slowing into the steady rhythm of an animal that had finally been told that everything was going to be okay. The lobby was so silent that Alina could hear the rain hitting the windows, and she could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her back. She stepped past Hades without looking at him again, approached the stretcher, and placed 2 steady fingers against the commander's throat to check his pulse. If Hades had allowed anyone to touch his commander, it was because Alina had earned a kind of trust that could not be bought or begged. It had to be forged in fire. The commander's pulse was threadbare, fluttering underneath her fingertips like a moth trapped under glass, and Alina knew without being told that he had minutes left, maybe less. She turned her head and spoke directly to Dr. Marcus, but her voice was different now, sharper, crisper, the voice of a woman who had not been a janitor at all. She told Dr. Marcus to bring her a defibrillator, 2 bags of O-negative blood, a chest seal, an IV line, and a vial of sodium bicarbonate. She told him to clear trauma room 1 immediately, and to send every available nurse into the room to assist her. And she told him that if any of those supplies were not in her hands in the next 90 seconds, the commander would be dead, and there would be nobody to blame but the head doctor of St. Bridget's Medical Center. Dr. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but something about the way Alina was standing, the way her shoulders had straightened, the way her eyes burned with the kind of focus that battlefield medics wore like armor, made him obey without a word. He turned and shouted orders to the staff, and within seconds the quiet ghost of St. Bridget's was surrounded by a swarm of nurses carrying equipment into trauma room 1. Alina worked. She worked like a machine, her hands never shaking, her limp forgotten, her mind operating on a level that Dr. Marcus had never seen in any nurse he had ever worked alongside. She cut open the commander's tactical vest with a pair of trauma shears, exposing a chest that was mottled with old scars and fresh bruises, and she placed the defibrillator pads with the kind of precision that comes only from years of treating wounds in the dark, in helicopters, in rocky outcroppings at the edge of nowhere. She shocked him once. The commander's body jolted upward. She checked the monitor. Flatline. She shocked him again. The lobby outside was so packed with curious onlookers that they could see the silhouette of Alina's shadow on the frosted glass, working furiously to save the life of a man the whole country had been told was invincible. The third shock came. The commander's heart jumped back into rhythm with an audible beep that echoed through the open door, and Dr. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand over his mouth, his glasses fogged with sweat. The nurses in the room looked at Alina with expressions of pure disbelief, because what they had just witnessed was not something that happened in regular hospitals. What they had just witnessed was something that happened in field hospitals behind enemy lines, where medics had to save lives with nothing but their bare hands and whatever they could carry on their backs. Alina did not stop to celebrate. She placed the IV line, opened the blood bag, and adjusted the commander's oxygen mask, and she barked out a series of medical orders to the nurses around her that were so specific and so tactical that one of the younger interns fainted and had to be dragged out of the room by his colleagues. If you are watching this story unfold in disbelief, please like and subscribe, because what happens next will stay with you for the rest of your life. When the commander was finally stabilized, when his vitals had been logged into the monitor and the color had begun to return to his cheeks, Alina stepped back from the stretcher and removed her blood-stained gloves. She did not speak. She did not explain herself. She simply walked back out into the lobby, where Hades was still sitting in the exact spot she had left him, his eyes tracking her movement with the devotion of a soldier watching his commanding officer pass by. Alina stopped beside the dog for just a moment, placed her hand gently on the top of his head, and whispered something into his ear that nobody else in the room could hear. Hades leaned his massive body into her leg, and for the first time since he had stormed through the hospital doors, the loyal animal closed his eyes and exhaled a long, slow breath of pure relief. The handler approached her, his face still pale with shock, and he asked her who she was. He asked her how she had known the K9 command codes, how she had been able to read the dog's body language like she had trained him herself, how she had managed to shock a flatline heart back to life without so much as flinching. Alina looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned her eyes toward the glass doors of the hospital, where the rain was still falling in thick silver sheets against the parking lot lights. She told him a story. She told him about a girl who had grown up in a small town in Texas, who had joined the army at 17 because she wanted to be somebody, who had been hand-selected at 22 to become one of the very first female military working dog handlers to ever deploy with a Navy SEAL team. She told him about her call sign, which had been Nightingale because the senior handler had said she sang to the dogs when they were scared. She told him about a deployment in 2013 when she had been paired with a young SEAL named Thomas Briggs, whose best friend in the entire world had been a Belgian Malinois named Brutus, and how she had grown to love them both so completely that she sometimes forgot there was supposed to be a line between attachment and professionalism. She told him about the day everything changed, the day a routine patrol had turned into an ambush, the day she had carried Thomas for 6 miles through a sandstorm with blood pouring from her leg, refusing to put him down even when the pain made her vision go white. She told him how Thomas had died in her arms 2 hours before they reached the extraction point, and how Brutus had laid his head on Thomas's chest and howled in a way that no dog had ever howled before, a sound that Alina could still hear in her dreams if she was quiet enough to listen. She told him that Brutus had been retired from service after that deployment, because a dog that had lost his handler could not be trusted to bond with another, and that Brutus had been adopted by Thomas's mother in Ohio, where he lived out the rest of his days, sleeping on Thomas's childhood bed. She told him about her injury, the metal fragment that had been lodged in her spine by an improvised explosive device, the surgery that had taken 14 hours, the months of physical therapy that she had gone through alone because her mother had already passed, and her father had stopped returning her phone calls the day she shipped out for basic training. She told him that the army had offered her a desk job, but she had refused it because she could not stand the idea of being a person who pushed paper instead of saving lives, so she had taken a medical discharge, moved to the city, and become the night shift janitor at a hospital that did not know her name. She became the ghost because ghosts do not have to explain themselves to anyone. If you believe that Alina's story deserves to be heard by the world, please share this video with a friend who loves a great story. Sharing is how these voices finally reach the people who need them most. The handler listened to her without interrupting, his eyes growing wider with every sentence, and when she finally stopped talking, he reached up and removed his cap in a gesture of respect that operators rarely performed for anyone outside their own brotherhood. He apologized to her. He apologized for every year that she had spent cleaning floors while carrying the weight of a war that nobody else in the hospital could even see, and he told her that what she had done tonight was something that no ordinary nurse could have done. Alina shrugged her shoulders and told him that she was just doing her job, but the handler could see the tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, and he knew that she was not talking about the job at all. She was talking about Thomas. She was talking about Brutus. She was talking about every night she had spent alone on the 3rd floor of the hospital, mopping the empty corridors and praying that the ghosts of her past would stay buried where she had buried them. Inside Trauma Room 1, the commander's eyes fluttered open, and the first thing he saw was Dr. Marcus leaning over him with a look of absolute astonishment on his face. The commander tried to sit up, but his body was too weak, and he fell back against the pillow with a frustrated grunt. He asked Dr. Marcus who had saved him, and the doctor hesitated, glancing through the glass window toward the lobby, where Alina was still standing beside Hades with her hand resting gently on the dog's massive head. The commander followed his gaze, and even through the fog of pain and medication, he recognized something about the way the woman was standing, the way her shoulders were set, the way the dog was watching her with the kind of devotion that only comes from years of trust forged in the field. The commander demanded to be brought out to the lobby, and Dr. Marcus tried to argue with him, telling him he needed rest, telling him he needed monitoring, telling him that he was lucky to be alive and he should not be pushing himself. But the commander was not a man who took orders from doctors. He was a man who gave orders, and he wanted to see the woman who had pulled him back from the edge of death. 2 nurses helped him into a wheelchair, draped a blanket around his shoulders, and wheeled him out through the double doors of Trauma Room 1. The lobby had mostly emptied by then, the operators having retreated to the parking lot to make phone calls and coordinate their next moves, but a few curious nurses lingered in the corners, watching with wide eyes as the commander's wheelchair rolled to a stop in front of Alina and Hades. Hades stood up the moment the wheelchair approached, and he padded softly over to his commander, pressing his nose gently against the commander's hand and making a soft whimpering sound that sounded almost like a child crying for his mother. The commander reached out and placed his hand on the dog's head, scratching him behind the ear with the familiarity of a man who had been paired with this animal through 5 deployments and 3 combat zones, and then he lifted his eyes to Alina. He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the grey streak in her hair, the scar along her temple, the tired lines around her eyes, and the slight tremor in her left leg that she tried so hard to hide. He asked her name. Elena told him. He asked her how she had known the K9 commands. Elena told him she had once been a handler. He asked her call sign, and when she answered Nightingale, the commander's breath hitched in his chest so deeply that Hades looked up at him with concern. The commander had once known a Nightingale. Thomas Briggs had once spoken about a handler named Nightingale who had carried his brother out of a combat zone and watched him die with a strength that he had never seen in another human being. The commander knew her because Thomas had been his cousin, and Thomas had talked about Elena Castillo the way that only soldiers talk about the people who held their hands when they were scared in the dark. The commander reached out with one trembling hand and took Elena's hand into his own, and he held it there for a long moment before he spoke. He told her that he knew who she was. He told her that Thomas had loved her like a sister. He told her that Brutus had lived out his remaining years in peace on Thomas's mother's farm, and that he had died only last winter peacefully in his sleep, on the same pillow that Thomas had once slept on. Elena's face crumbled. The tears she had been holding back for 11 years finally broke through the dam of her composure, and she sat down on the lobby floor beside the commander's wheelchair, pressing her face into her hands and shaking with sobs that made her whole body tremble. Hades walked over and pressed his head against her side, a sympathetic gesture that seemed to say he understood grief in a way that no human ever could. If this story has ever made you cry, hit the like button so other people can find it when they need it most. The commander did not stop her. He did not tell her to be strong. He did not tell her to pull herself together. He simply sat with her in the silence of the empty lobby, his hand still holding hers, his eyes glistening with his own unshed tears. He understood that Elena was not just grieving Thomas anymore. She was grieving 11 lost years. 11 years of hiding from a world that had given her a medal and then forgotten her name. 11 years of pretending she was less than she was because it was easier to be invisible than it was to be remembered. He understood that saving his life had been her way of saying goodbye to the only version of herself she had ever truly been proud of, the version that had held Thomas in her arms in a sandstorm and refused to let go even when the world was on fire. When Elena finally looked up, the commander asked her a question that nobody else in the hospital would have thought to ask. He asked her if she missed it. He asked her if she missed the dogs, the deployments, the brotherhood that no civilian could ever understand. Elena hesitated, and then she nodded, just once, a small motion that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken confessions. The commander smiled at her, and it was the first time that anybody in the hospital had ever seen him smile since he had been carried in through those doors. He told her that the special operations community was always looking for experienced handlers to come back and train the next generation of K9 teams. He told her that Thomas's mother had been asking for years if anyone had ever heard from Nightingale, because Thomas had made her promise to find Elena if anything ever happened to him, to tell her that Brutus had lived a good life, to tell her that her sacrifice had not been forgotten. He told Elena that there was a puppy waiting for her at a base in Virginia, a Belgian Malinois with a gentle soul and bright eyes, who needed a handler who knew how to turn a scared animal into a warrior and back again. He told her that she owed it to Thomas, and to Brutus, and to every dog who had ever trusted her to come home. Elena sat quietly for a long time. She thought about the mop she had set down on the lobby floor. She thought about the apartment she rented on the east side of the city with the leaky faucet and the broken heater. She thought about every patient who had looked through her like she was nothing, every doctor who had walked past her without saying good morning. Every night she had spent alone on the 3rd floor wondering if the pain in her leg would ever stop, feeling like a punishment for a war she had not been able to finish. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about Thomas Briggs, who had been her best friend in a world that had tried to take everything from both of them, and she made a decision that she had been making every day for the past 11 years without realizing it. She had been waiting. She had been waiting for someone to tell her that it was okay to stop hiding. She had been waiting for someone to remind her that ghosts are allowed to come back to life if they want to. If Elena's story has touched your heart tonight, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell. We tell these stories for people like Elena, and for people like you, who believe that the world is still full of quiet heroes waiting to be found. Elena told the commander that she would think about it. The commander nodded, understanding that some decisions cannot be made in a single moment, no matter how important that moment feels. He thanked her again, this time in words that carried the formal weight of a man who had just been given his life back by a woman nobody had ever bothered to know. And then he asked the nurses to wheel him back into Trauma Room 1 so that he could rest. As the wheelchair disappeared through the double doors, Hades pressed his head against Alina's hand one more time, and then padded quietly after his commander, his nails clicking softly against the tile floor. The lobby was empty now, save for a single nurse at the far end of the corridor who had witnessed everything and was staring at Alina with an expression that could only be described as awe. Alina stood up. She picked up her mop from where she had left it leaning against the wall. She walked back to her cart and pushed it slowly toward the supply closet at the end of the hallway, her limp a little more pronounced than it had been at the start of the night, but her shoulders a little straighter. She disappeared around the corner without saying a word to anyone, because Alina Castillo had spent 11 years learning how to be invisible, and old habits did not break in a single night. But something had changed inside her, something deep and permanent, and as she pushed her cart through the empty hallway she allowed herself, for the first time in over a decade, to think about what it might feel like to fly again. The night shift ended at 6 in the morning, when the sun began to peek up over the hospital roof and turn the windows into panels of pale gold. Alina clocked out at the timecard machine and stepped outside into the rain, which had finally stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the streetlights. She stood under the awning for a long moment, her hands in her pockets, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she looked up at the sky as if she were trying to remember what it felt like to look up at the sky from a country where the constellations were different. A taxi pulled up to the entrance, its driver honking softly to ask if she needed a ride, and Alina shook her head and smiled at the driver. She wanted to walk. She wanted to feel her feet on the pavement, to feel the cold air in her lungs, to feel every moment of the night she had just lived settle into her bones like a memory she would finally allow herself to keep. She walked home through the empty streets, past the late-night diners and the shuttered storefronts and the streetlights that flickered like. They were tired, and she thought about Brutus, lying on Thomas's pillow in Ohio, and she thought about Thomas, buried in Arlington under a stone she had visited every year on the anniversary of his death, and she thought about the puppy waiting for her at a base in Virginia with bright eyes and a gentle soul. She thought about all of these things, and she cried quietly as she walked, but the tears that fell from her eyes were not the tears she had been shedding for the past 11 years. These were new tears. These were the tears of a woman who had finally been reminded that she was not a ghost, that she was not a janitor, that she was not a punishment, that she was Nightingale, and that Nightingale was allowed to fly again if she wanted to. If you have ever felt invisible, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. The world is full of people who are waiting for permission to come home to themselves. When Alina reached her building, she climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly because her leg was tired, and she unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside into the small, quiet space that had been her prison for the past 11 years. She did not turn on the lights. She walked straight to her bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed, and reached underneath it to pull out a cardboard box that she had not opened in over a decade. The box was dusty, and when she lifted the lid, the smell of old paper and faint gunpowder rose up into the air like a ghost. Inside the box were her medals, her formal discharge papers, a photograph of Thomas and Brutus smiling in front of a Black Hawk helicopter, a letter from Thomas's mother that she had never had the courage to answer. Alina held the photograph in her hands for a long time, studying Thomas's face, studying the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and finally she allowed herself to say the words that she had been carrying in her chest for 11 years. She told Thomas she was sorry. She told Thomas she had tried to live the life he had wanted her to live. She told Thomas that Brutus had been loved, and that she had been loved, and that it was finally time for her to come home. The next morning, Alina did not go to work. She did not call in sick, and she did not explain herself to anyone. She simply packed a small bag, left her apartment key on the counter, and took a taxi to the airport. She bought a one-way ticket to Virginia with the small savings she had kept at the bottom of her sock drawer, and when the plane lifted off from the runway and the city disappeared below her into a sea of morning fog, she pressed her forehead against the cold window and whispered the word that had once been her call sign and that she was finally ready to wear again. Nightingale. The word felt like a prayer. The word felt like a promise. The word felt like a woman who had spent 11 years as a ghost, finally, being given permission to remember that she had always had wings. At the base in Virginia, a young sergeant led her to a kennel filled with the soft sounds of dogs yawning and stretching in their sleep. And there, in the last kennel on the right, was a tiny Belgian Malinois puppy, with bright amber eyes and ears too big for his head. He saw Alina approach, and his whole body began to wag, not just his tail but every muscle from his nose to the tips of his paws, and he pressed his cold black nose against the wire mesh and let out a single soft whimper that sounded like welcome home. Alina knelt down in front of the kennel and placed her hand against the wire, and the puppy leaned his whole weight against her palm, and she closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The young sergeant asked her what she wanted to call him. Alina thought about it for a moment. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Brutus. She thought about Hades and the commander and the long hallway of St. Bridget's Medical Center, where she had finally been seen for the first time in 11 years. She thought about a small town in Texas where she had once been a girl who wanted to be somebody, and she opened her eyes and told the sergeant that the puppy's name would be Hope. If you believe that second chances exist for everyone, please hit subscribe and share this video. There is someone out there tonight who needs to hear this story to remind them that they are not invisible. The puppy that Alina named Hope would go on to become one of the most decorated military working dogs in the history of the Special Operations community. A Malinois who saved countless lives in deployments that historians would study for generations. Hope served beside Alina for 7 years until a sudden illness forced the dog into a peaceful retirement at Thomas's mother's farm in Ohio, where he would sleep on Thomas's pillow, beside a framed photograph of a handler named Nightingale who had once carried his best friend 6 miles through a sandstorm and refused to put him down. Until the world was safe enough for him to rest. Every operator who met Hope described him the same way. They said he was loyal beyond reason. They said he was brave beyond measure. They said he had a gentleness in his eyes that came from a handler who had taught him that love was a strength and not a weakness, and that the greatest warriors in the world are the ones who know how to be soft in the right moments. They said that Hope carried something special inside him, something that only a true handler could recognize, and that whatever it was, it had been passed down from a long line of dogs and trainers who had loved each other across oceans and decades and impossible distances. Alina would eventually retire from the Special Operations community at the age of 50, after a knee replacement surgery that finally fixed the leg she had injured 11 years ago in a country she still could not pronounce correctly. She would move back to the small town in Texas where she had grown up, where she had once been a girl who wanted to be somebody, and she would open a small training facility on the edge of her father's old property, where she would teach young handlers how to bond with their animals, how to read the silence of a dog that was ready to defend his handler, how to recognize the difference between aggression and fear, how to be the kind of person that an animal can trust with his life. Her father, who had stopped returning her phone calls the day she shipped out for basic training, would come to her graduation from handler school and sit in the front row with tears streaming down his face, and he would stand up after the ceremony was over and wrap his arms around his daughter for the first time in over 30 years. He would tell her that he was proud of her. He would tell her that he had been wrong. He would tell her that Thomas's mother had written to him years ago to tell him about Alina and what she had done for her son in the desert, and that he had carried that letter in his wallet every day since then, unable to find the words to apologize for all the years he had spent pretending that his daughter did not exist. If you have stayed with Alina all the way to this moment, you are part of the family we are building here. Subscribe today and join us as we continue to share the untold stories of the world's quietest heroes. The commander from the hospital lobby would eventually be promoted to admiral, and he would credit Alina in every interview he gave for the rest of his career, telling audiences around the world about the night that a woman with a mop and a limp had looked into the eyes of his dog and spoken the language of the battlefield, and how that single moment had reminded him that the true measure of a soldier is not the medals on his chest, but the love in his hands. Hades would retire peacefully at the Admiral's home in California, and he would sleep at the foot of the Admiral's bed every night for the rest of his life, dreaming dreams that no dog has ever been able to describe to a human. Dr. Marcus would redesign the entire triage protocol at St. Bridget's Medical Center after that night, adding a permanent section to the employee handbook about respecting the people who clean the floors, because, as he would write in his foreword, you never know who is sweeping the hallway beside you. He would also quietly create a small scholarship in Alina's name, funded by an anonymous donor whose handwriting matched the military precision of a Navy SEAL admiral. And every year a single janitor at the hospital would be selected to receive a full ride to nursing school in Alina's honor. And on the 3rd floor of St. Bridget's Medical Center, in a small break room that smelled like burnt coffee and old disinfectant, a plaque would be mounted on the wall in the weeks after Alina left. It was a simple plaque, made of dark wood and brass, with a single line of text engraved in clean military lettering that read, "For the ghosts who became lifelines." And every nurse who walked past that plaque on their shift would pause, just for a moment, and think about the quiet people who worked beside them, the people who carried their own wars in their silence, the people who had once been heroes and had chosen, for reasons of their own, to walk among us as something smaller. And they would wonder, just for a moment, who among them was carrying a story that nobody else knew. If you have ever felt like a ghost, take a moment to subscribe and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. There are more hidden heroes in this world than we will ever know, but we can keep telling their stories until the silence finally ends. This was the story of Alina Castillo, who was once called Nightingale, who once carried her best friend 6 miles through a sandstorm, who spent 11 years hiding from a world that had forgotten her name, and who was finally reminded one rainy night in a hospital lobby that she had always had wings. She did not become famous. She did not win any new medals. She did not write a book or give a single interview. She simply went back to doing what she had always done, which was to love the animals that were brave enough to trust her, and to teach the next generation of handlers that the bond between a soldier and a dog is the purest form of love that this broken world has ever produced. Her story will not be taught in schools. Her name will not appear in any history book. But somewhere on a farm in Ohio, there is a photograph on a pillow, and somewhere in Virginia there is a training facility with a sign that says, "Welcome home." And somewhere in Texas, there is an old man who carries a letter in his wallet because it reminds him that his daughter is the bravest person he has ever known. This has been a story for the hidden heroes. Subscribe today and join us for the next one. You never know whose life you might be saving when you decide to believe in someone the world has stopped seeing. If this story stayed with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that they are not invisible. The world is full of ghost nurses waiting for someone to call them Nightingale.